Welcome to the Bible Lab. Our goal every week is to take our questions about God and about life into the lab of God's truth, giving you tools to use as you study the Word of God for yourself. God's Word tells us the amazing story of a fallen creation, the Savior who redeemed it, and the history of how it all unfolded. Welcome to Season 2 as we journey from cover to cover on the Bible Lab. Thanks for joining us. Filthy man.
Welcome back to the Bible Lab. My name is Jake Spielbauer, and I am one of the hosts here at the Bible Lab, and I'm joined in studio today.
Joel's back.
That's right, Joel is back, and we are making our way into the prophetic books of the Bible. Today we are covering chapters 11 through 24 of the book of Isaiah. We have been working, of course, through the Bible in a year, and our weekly podcast covers 23 chapters as we read 3 chapters a day and 5 on Sunday. And we are now switching genres.
Yes,
Hooray.
we are. Turning another corner.
That's right. And that's a big deal as we read the Bible to pay attention to what we're reading. And we've just crossed a major division as we are preparing to kind of head into the home stretch of the Old Testament. We've wrapped up the wisdom literature of the Bible, and we are now entering into a very unique kind of literature. I am pumped to talk about it, but it is going to be a challenge and an adventure because this is probably the hardest part of the Bible to interpret.
There's a lot going on with this section of the Bible, and I'm looking forward to getting into this today.
Yeah, the prophets are vivid, and I was thinking about kind of a random thought, which I'm known for having these kind of strange rabbit trails.
I like random.
When I started taking magnesium supplements, okay, this year to be like, what the heck? Where is this going? Okay, so I'm a big believer in magnesium as a supplement. It's really helpful. So it helps with sleep and all these sorts of things. Totally natural supplement. And so I started taking it a while back before bed every night. And it can help with like calming your nerves and all this stuff. But the first few nights that you take it, you have like the most vivid dreams you've ever had. Like just not like even like crazy or we're just super vivid. And I kind of feel like that's how it feels to go into the prophets for the first time.
Yes.
Like you're just, you have dreams every night, but they were just kind of like really intense. You remembered them really, really vividly. And that kind of is how it feels to go into the prophets. It's like this shockingly like vivid, colorful, the language is really strong. And so you can tell you're in different territory, I feel like, as you cross into the prophetic books of the Old Testament.
Yeah, when you're reading through these books of the Bible for the first time ever, it's a lot to take in, and the language is confusing. I don't know. I'm looking forward to unpack this today. I'm going to be honest. I was kind of struggling with some of these readings. There's, of course, some of the messages of hope that are sprinkled throughout there that are, this verse is really encouraging and uplifting. Let's highlight this. Let's underline this. But a lot of it is just confusing. And I'll be honest, I was finding myself confused. So I feel like the disclaimer here is I feel like my seat today is going to be more reactive and making comments on Jake's expertise rather than being insightful.
Well, we'll see, man. On expertise is probably you being too kind, but I think a good goal today would be we're going to talk a little bit about the specific text in Isaiah, but since the next few weeks, in fact, a lot of where we're going to be for a while is going to be moving through the prophets. I think it'd be good for us to touch on some tools and maybe help people to understand how to read this well, because if you can start to do, and I don't think you're not going to nail the prophets if you're a casual reader of the Bible, it's always going to involve a lot more work than other parts of the Bible just because of the format. But I think a goal would be to give you some tools so that you can start to ask the sorts of questions that will help you to be able to identify at least what's going on, because that's the first job. Before we can get to any questions about, well, what does this mean for us? We have to do a lot of homework in the prophets, asking the question of what was the prophet trying to say to the people of their day. And that's probably the most important thing to start with. Is the starting point for the prophets is the prophets are saying something really important first and foremost to people in their day, not to people in our day. And people will bristle at that because they'll feel like, well, are you saying that the Bible isn't, that this part of the Bible doesn't mean anything for us? Well, no, we're not saying that at all. But in order to understand what God's saying to us, we first have to get that these guys weren't talking directly to us. They were talking to the society and the culture in which they lived, because they had a very important role. And a way to maybe think about it is the prophets were God's megaphone to shout at his people. I think is a really simple way to understand it. And that's kind of what it feels like. You kind of feel like someone's putting a megaphone right in your face and screaming at you, because that's exactly what they were doing. The prophets were called to be abrasive and loud and even shocking to the people in their day, because there was danger, there were problems, and they were calling them out. So as we get into the prophets, we're just going to do a basic overview. A lot of this, if any of our listeners have been a part of our Better Bible Reading class here at LifeBridge, this is going to sound familiar because this is exactly what we've just been studying and talking about together. But to give you a brief breakdown, there are 16 prophetic books in the Old Testament. 4 of them we refer to as major prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. Lamentations is included in that because it's written by Jeremiah. So we have those 4 guys that are referred to as the major prophets. Yes. And then we have what are called the minor prophets. There's 12 of them. Bonus points if you can memorize them. There's 12 of them. That would be Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Now, in traditional organization of the Old Testament, the minor prophets actually compiled one large volume that was just referred to as the 12. Okay.
Interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we say major and minor, what we're not saying is that some of them are more important and some of them are of minor importance. In fact, Jesus quotes from the minor prophets. Revelation draws from the minor prophets extensively. A lot of references to Zechariah, for example, are found in Revelation. So really, it's just an observation of length that Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel are long books. But they're difficult to read, specifically because of the function and their form. Okay, so 2 things I think that would be good for us to understand today would be the function of the prophets and the form of their writings. Starting with the function, we kind of touched on this, but the big thing to understand is that the purpose of the prophets was not to tell us about things that are yet to happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's making sense.
And I think a lot of modern misunderstanding of the prophets comes from the fact that people will go to the prophets and try to read them like they're a code for our future. So people will go to the prophets asking, what do they have to say about the nations in our day? Where can we find modern nation states represented within the prophetic books? What do they have to say about the end of the world? What do they have to say about the end times? And if we start from that place, we're going to be getting off on the wrong foot, because that's not the primary purpose of reading them. The prophets were first and foremost meant to be truth tellers who spoke for God to the people of their day. And so they were God's direct representatives, meant to speak to the people to share God's perspective. You could think of them as, like, I guess, if you think about all the nations of the earth as like players on a football field, right? The prophets are the guys up in the box who are speaking from God's perspective about what's happening
Yes.
on the field of play. Does that kind of make sense a little bit?
Yep, I'm tracking. That's the role of the prophet. They are speaking on God's behalf.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we read it, the first thing we want to understand is that they're not giving their own opinions. They're speaking for God.
And if they were giving their own opinion, that's what we're probably calling a false prophet.
Boom. Nailed it. Exactly. What does Peter say? Oh, man. When he's talking about this, he said, no prophet ever spoke of his own. Oh, man, I should have this down. He never spoke of his own. Man, I'm failing the scripture test. But instead, they spoke as they were carried along by the Holy Spirit. All right. So basically, the prophetic books are not their own invention. They're not doing creative writing. They're speaking for God. They have God's authority to relay his message. And specifically, they're focused, like I said, not on our future, but on Israel's future. And so they are giving social critiques of God's people, and they're giving critiques of the other nations of their day. Some other important info about their role. The prophets were set apart by God to be covenant enforcement mediators. And kind of the way I think about that is like in an old Western, you'd have the sheriff, and when the bad guys rolled into town, they would deputize certain people to help fight the bad guys. Well, in the prophets are deputized or called by God to announce his consequences because the people have not kept the covenant. So this gets into biblical history a little bit. If we understand where the prophets are coming in, we have to know the history of Israel. So in sum, the basic history of Israel is at Sinai, God defines, you're going to be my people, I'm going to be your God. And this is basically like a wedding ceremony. God is giving himself in marriage to the people of Israel, and he gives them the marriage vows. And he says, this is the law. You keep these ordinances, these regulations, we're going to have a great relationship. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to establish you in the promised land. Things are going to be great. Your livestock are going to be well fed. The land is going to produce fruit for you, and all the blessings are going to be poured out on you and on your descendants. But if you don't, here's what's going to happen. And you can find this, a key text for this is Deuteronomy chapter 28 for people that want to do further study. In Deuteronomy 28, God then also says, right after this, he says, if you don't keep the covenant, here's what's going to happen to you. You're going to experience all of the plagues of Egypt. I'm going to pour them out on you. And people from a land that's far away are going to come, and they're going to scatter you among the nations. They're going to lead you out of the land, and you're going to lose your identity as a people.
Yep, and the people of that day, they said, yes and amen to that. We agree to the terms. We agree to the covenant. And they followed the covenants for a bit.
Yeah.
A bit.
A little bit. Kind of.
And then the kings came along and led their people further away from God. And then the prophets had to come along and kind of, course correct isn't the right word. That's what Jesus did. Jesus course corrected and fixed and redeemed everything. The prophets came and called them out on how far gone they were going.
That's exactly right. I mean, at Sinai, the people said, we do. Okay. God said, hey, do you take me to be your God, to have and to hold in sickness and in health? Yeah. That's the wedding ceremony. And they stood there and they ratified the covenant and said, we do. Again, in Deuteronomy, when they renew the covenant, okay, they circumcise all the men before they go into the promised land, and they ratify the covenant again, and they agree. Yes, we do. And then the problem is they don't. And so God then raises up the prophets to announce, you broke the covenant, and here's what's going to happen. And so that we have to understand that's the place where the prophets are coming from. So when you think, wow, the prophets sound really harsh, they're announcing all these disasters. They're announcing that foreign nations are going to come, especially as we get into Isaiah. Isaiah is happening prior to the exile of Judah. He is alive, and he is prophesying and ministering while the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes of the north, which is referred to as Ephraim or Israel or the capital city, Samaria, they are raided and destroyed and carried off in exile by the Assyrians. So he is watching this unfold, and the prophets are essentially starting to see what feels like the conclusion of the story, that this is not going to end well and that Israel has broken it off with God. So they're starting to look ahead to the exile, and they're starting to then see beyond it as well. So what we're getting is if we can place it within a historical setting, we're getting the prophets who are looking ahead into the exile. Then they're getting a word from the Lord about what's going to happen after exile. And then in places, we're seeing them reference something that God seems like he's going to do to redeem this whole thing, but they're seeing it kind of through a blurry lens where they're starting to talk about Jesus, but not in ways that seem super clear. And the focus of the prophets isn't exclusively on that. So we get a little bit of information, but even in the prophets, we don't get a super clear picture of what God's going to do. But I think that's super important to understand that the role of the prophets is tied to the history of Israel and what's happening in their covenant relationship with God at this point. And the sum of it is that the covenant's been broken. God is announcing consequences. He, of course, is commanding them, giving them a chance to turn back, but he knows they're not going to. So he's decreed that the Assyrians and then the Babylonians are going to be his instruments to carry out justice, but they're not going to get off the hook either, because then God's going to punish Assyria. Then he's going to punish Babylon. Then he's going to punish all of the nations that have oppressed Israel and harmed Israel. And from a world standpoint, it's really interesting to note, and we'll get into this as we get into actually the text of Isaiah this week. But in this point in history, what's happening is God is basically getting fed up. He's getting fed up with Israel and Judah, and he's even getting fed up with the wickedness of the nations. And so he's issuing judgment. Like, he is going through, as we kind of get into this, if you read chapters 11 through about 23 in Isaiah, he is just putting together a hit list of the nations. He just goes one after the other. Here's what's going to happen to Israel. Here's what's going to happen to Judah. Then here's what's going to happen to Babylon, Assyria, Tyre, Edom, Moab, all of these nations who have oppressed God's people and done evil. They're not getting off the hook. God is going to judge them all. And the world is going to see a period in history where God basically allows the nations to be consumed by violence and judgment. And what's crazy is that's exactly what happens. If you look at this window of history from about 700 BC until the time of Christ, you see empire after empire. You see the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and then they get destroyed by the Persians, and then they get destroyed by the Greeks, and then they all get destroyed by Rome, and then we get to the day of Jesus' coming. So this is the window of history into which we're going, and that's the context of what's happening. But the function of the prophets is to announce God's action, God's perspective, and what and how to understand what he's going to do from a spiritual standpoint. So that's the function of prophecy. When we get to the form of prophecy, and this is where this is helpful to us as readers, in order to pay attention to what we're reading, we have to understand that these are collections of sayings. And I think this is probably, if you're looking for one really easy takeaway that can impact your reading of the prophets right away, don't read them like a story, because they don't read that way.
It's a weird story if you do try to read it as a story.
Yeah, if you try to read this and trace like a common thread, like, okay, how is Isaiah following the line of his thinking throughout the whole book? Well, there isn't one single line of thinking because it's not one single writing. What happened is Isaiah was a preacher. And so he would preach different messages at different times. And after his ministry was concluded, people took his sayings and compiled them in like an anthology of Isaiah's greatest hits. and put them together. And that's what we have as the book of Isaiah. So we don't want to think just in terms of like this as just one body of work. We want to think in terms of individual sayings and individual speeches given by Isaiah. The word that we would use is oracles. So when Isaiah is speaking for the Lord and he gives a speech, we call that speech an oracle. And you can pay attention as you read this as a student of the word. The most important question to ask is, when does one oracle stop and does another one start? Okay, the reason that you mentioned, hey, it's kind of hard to track what's going on here. Well, that's because in our reading plan, we're reading by chapters. Okay,
right, yep.
But really, we should be reading by oracles.
Okay, that's making sense. And some of these oracles are going from one chapter to the next, chapter and a half, 2 chapters. It's not consistent.
That's exactly right. So this is where we have to actually read really carefully and ask 2 important questions that I think can be really clarifying. Who is Isaiah talking about, and when is he talking about? Because back to back, you'll read one thing that's spoken to one group of people that sounds like it's going to happen immediately. Like there's a couple places in Isaiah where he says, hey, this is going to happen within a year. He comes right out and says it. This is going to happen in a year, so get ready. And then he'll jump to some sort of eschatological oracle where he's talking about redemption, which is something that we would look back now and see is being fulfilled through Christ. And so paying attention to clues can be really helpful. So we should always be asking, who is he talking about and when is he talking about? And there's probably a few things that could be helpful in tracking when does one oracle end and another one begins. One would be just pay attention to transitional words and phrases. So if you notice at the beginning of an oracle, he'll say things like, on that day, this is going to happen, right? Or he'll say something like, this is really telling. In the section that we read this week, a section will start with, a pronouncement against this group of people. Well, that's a clue to you as the reader. He's starting a new topic, okay?
Yep, that's making it a lot more clear. This is probably a mistake that I made while reading through this, but Isaiah's not linear. It's not chronological.
It's not chronological.
I was kind of reading it, expecting it to be, and getting lost in the middle of it.
Yeah. No, it's definitely not. There are some points in the book where he does anchor the prophecy or what he's saying to a specific series of events. Like when you get to, I believe it's Isaiah 38, you read him starting to describe what happens when Sennacherib, who is the leader of the Assyrians, leads an invasion against the kingdom of Judah and surrounds Jerusalem. So then we know, okay, well, that happened like right around, I think, 700 BC, like right around the turn of the century. So then we know that what he says after that is, relevant to that time period. But you're right that Isaiah and the other prophets aren't necessarily presenting their sayings in chronological order. So if we try to read that way, it's going to feel really confusing. So pay attention to transitional words and phrases. Notice when he's changing the target of the oracle or when he's putting a new group of people in the crosshairs, because that's a sign that he's changed subject. And then another thing that could be really helpful that we'll get into is paying attention to the different types of oracles, because there's different forms of oracles that get mentioned or get used throughout the prophets. And if you can track when we're reading one type of oracle versus another, it can help you to see those divisions. Specifically, let's just handle it. Yeah. There's 5 different types of oracles. At least we've been working through a book called How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth by Gordon Fee. I think the other author's name is Douglas Stewart. And they mention 5 different types of oracles. Now, Isaiah doesn't tell you, hey, here are the 5 types of things I'm going to use, but these are some general patterns that we see. And I pulled some examples of them from the book of Isaiah, since that's what we're studying. The first one that they mention is the lawsuit oracle. And this is where God begins or takes up legal proceedings against a group of people.
Yep, that seems pretty self-explanatory. I'm going to guess that without even turning to Isaiah 3, which I have in the notes, as probably God telling the people, this was the covenant, you broke it.
Yeah, absolutely. And the language in Isaiah 3 is pretty striking. He says in chapter 3, verse 13, the Lord rises to argue the case and stands to judge the people. Okay, so he rises to judge the case like a prosecutor. He gets up from his seat to argue the case before the heavenly court, and he gets ready to judge the people. It says in verse 14, the Lord brings this charge against the elders and leaders of his people. You have devastated the vineyard. The plunder from the poor is in your houses. Why do you crush my people and grind the faces of the poor? This is the declaration of the Lord God of armies. So God brings a lawsuit against his people that, hey, I gave you the promised land. This was my vineyard. My people are my vineyard. And I wanted you to bring about fruit, but instead you crushed it. You crushed the poor and needy. Rather than being an example of righteousness and justice to the nations, you destroyed it. Now that's important because if you remember, Jesus in his ministry, when he's talking to the Pharisees, he tells them a parable. He tells them a parable about tenants who are leasing a vineyard and how the owner of the vineyard returns wanting fruit, okay, and he sends messengers, but rather than answer them, they kill the messengers. Eventually he sends the son, they kill the son, and then he asks the question, what do you think God's going to do to the wicked tenants who abused the vineyard and killed the owner's son? Jesus is drawing from this exact scripture in Isaiah, and so Jesus is picking up on that lawsuit oracle in the way that he's responding to the Pharisees.
Yeah. Yep, and God is not going to take lightly to the ways that his people have broken the covenant and the sins that they have committed, the violent things that they have committed.
Yeah. Absolutely. Which brings up another good point that one of the reasons it's so important, even though it's difficult to do good work in the prophets, is that we can't understand Jesus's ministry and Jesus's preaching without having some knowledge of the prophets, because that's what he was formed by. Jesus comes along and he speaks just like the Old Testament prophets. Of course, he knew the prophets. He had them memorized. He quotes from them all the time. And so if we're going to understand a lot of the things that Jesus was saying to the people in his day, a great place to start is by getting a background, getting familiar in the prophets. So that's the lawsuit oracle. Another common one that's the easiest one to identify is the woe oracle, which is basically a warning of impending disaster.
Yep, just the language there, woe to you.
Yeah, and that's exactly what you'll see. They're easy to identify because the prophet just says, hey, woe to you guys. Woe to Babylon. Woe to you bad guys who've done this, that, and the other thing. Here's what God's going to do. You can read an example of that in Isaiah 28. Isaiah pronounces woe upon Samaria because they're focused on partying and drinking more than on doing what's right. And so God says, well, I've got a drink for you, and it's going to flood Samaria when I sweep across the land in judgment. The third type of oracle that we see is a promise oracle. This can be positive or negative, but it's when the prophet announces that something that God's going to do. Good example of that from our reading this week was Isaiah 11. And actually, that's an important text because that is a messianic prophecy. It's one that we come back to and read often during Advent, but you may recognize this one. Isaiah 11, starting in verse 1, says, then a shoot will grow from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest upon him, a spirit of wisdom and understanding, a spirit of counsel and strength, a spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord. His delight will be in the fear of the Lord. He will not judge by what he sees with his eyes. He will not execute justice by what he hears with his ears, but he will judge the poor righteously and execute justice for the oppressed of the land. So, promise oracles.
Yes. Yeah, side note with that one, I love the imagery of the stump in this, and it goes along so well with just things that we've already talked about on this podcast and just what we believe as a church of there being one people of God. There's one tree. It was Israel. It included only Israel, and now it's the church.
Yep.
Just still one stump, one people of God.
Yeah, that's right. And he's referring to, the basically what's at this point, the tree of David's kingship has been cut down.
Right. It's not a tree anymore.
Yeah.
It's dead. It's a stump.
Yeah. But from it, he's going to bring new life because this stump, which gives an imagery of deadness, is going to bear fruit again. because there's going to be a righteous branch that grows from it. And that sets up for us the imagery of what Jesus teaches about him being the vine and how we grow as branches as an extension of him, that he is he is the shoot, the life-giving shoot that grows from the stump of Jesse and the seemingly dead tree of the Davidic kingship in the Old Covenant.
Yeah, that's really powerful stuff.
Then we get to a really fun one, which is the enactment prophecy. You can find a good example of this in chapter 20. One of the reasons that being a prophet was not a fun job was that God often called them to act out the messages that he had for his people. And there's some pretty memorable examples of this. But a sidebar on this is no one volunteered to be a prophet. These guys did not go out and apply for the job. It wasn't something that they sought after on their own. The word in Hebrew for prophet is the word nabi, which means called. So these are people who were called by God to this, and that's really important because it's not a job that was an easy one. These guys often were mistreated. They were persecuted. They were beaten because they had hard things to say that people didn't want to hear.
Not popular messages.
They were not popular messages. In fact, Isaiah's message to the people was, hey, you guys should, or Jeremiah's message to the people was, hey, you should surrender to Babylon. Don't try to fight them, because if you fight them, God's going to wipe you out. If you surrender, then there's a future for your people. And so they accused him of treason.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not comfortable.
And from their vantage point, that probably did sound like treason because they weren't looking at it from the lens of God, which is another just fatal mistake that they've made because they were so disconnected from their God. Yeah. Not just God, but this was their God.
That's right. So obedience to them sounded like treason. So being a prophet wasn't a fun job. This is why we always say, be skeptical of people who are excited to tell you that they're a prophet.
Yeah.
Because being a prophet is a job that came with a huge burden. It was not enjoyable. It came with, Jeremiah is called the weeping prophet because he prophesied and ministered during the siege and destruction and exile of Jerusalem. He watched it. He got, he was subject to the events that he was prophesying about. Isaiah, throughout his whole ministry, had 0 converts. No one listened. They ignored him completely, wow. And he ended up getting sawn in 2.
That'd be so discouraging.
Yeah, I think so.
Being able to carry on, they were able to carry on because they were that connected to God. You can only do that through God's strength. And fortunately, that's part of the job description is very close connection to God.
Absolutely, and that's a great takeaway as well. These were guys who, they're heroes of the faith for a reason because they did remain faithful to what God wanted them to do and what God called them to do. But one of the less enjoyable jobs that they had was to enact the prophecies that God gave them. So Isaiah is told to tell a prophecy about how Assyria is going to carry off the people of Egypt into exile, and how Assyria is going to lead them away from Egypt stripped and barefoot. And so God says, as an illustration of this, for 3 years, I want you to go around stripped and barefoot. So that meant every time that Isaiah was in public, he had to go out in his underwear and barefoot.
Wow. That's I'm trying to pick words there. Quite a demonstration of obedience.
Yeah, and it's not even probably the most difficult one. When we get to Ezekiel, God told Ezekiel, this
shocking.
One,
yes.
He told him, "Hey, I want you to start cooking your food over piles of human dung, because that's what the people are going to end up doing when they're conquered."
And that's an enactment prophecy.
Yes. And so Ezekiel, understandably, is like, God, please don't make me do this. I don't want to do that. And God's like, okay, I'll go easier on you. You can use cow dung instead.
Cow dung might be worse. I don't know.
I'm not sure.
I don't know.
Either way. And then, of course, Hosea, whose entire story is an enacted prophecy where God commands him to marry a prostitute because he says, that's what it's like for me as a groom being married to my people because they keep running away and being unfaithful and having affairs with other gods. So we'll read examples of that. That's the enactment prophecy, or the enacted parable. And then probably the most common type of oracle that we have is the messenger oracle. These are pretty easy to recognize as well because they start with phrases like this: a pronouncement concerning whoever.
Yeah.
And so basically these are oracles in which they're relaying a specific message from God word for word. They'll say other things like Isaiah says a couple of places in our reading from this past week: the Lord of armies has sworn, or the word of the Lord to this group of people. And that's a sign that, hey, what they're about to say, they are speaking word for word as a message from God. God put that message on their tongue. So all that to say, you can actually, as I was reading this week, one thing that I did is, as I was reading different sections or speeches, I would write down what type of oracle it was. And that helped me to track, okay, when you see a change in type of oracle, well, then you know for sure that Isaiah is starting a new section.
Yeah. Yeah, super helpful of how to break down this book. To recap all of it: 5 types of oracles: the lawsuit, the woe, the promise, the enactment, and the messenger.
Yeah. That's right. So I would encourage people to do that. As you're marking your Bibles, mark the separation between these different speeches, and you may find that, okay, if I start to just look at just this one passage or this one speech, what's the message or the big idea of this speech? Who is he talking to? When is this supposed to take place? And what is he saying is going to happen? Now, the thing that we can't get around, and this is where things get really messy in the prophets, is to answer those questions, we have to be hungry for history. There's just no way about it. No other way about it. We have to be students of biblical history at least a little bit if we're going to be able to answer those questions at all. Of course, there's some great tools available to you as you're reading the prophets. I don't know any way that you're going to be able to go about it well if you don't have a good commentary or a good Bible handbook or a good Bible dictionary to help you out.
Yeah.
Because we're separated culturally and historically by so much distance that it's really difficult to do unless you have some help. So finding a good Bible commentary is a must. If you're not into buying books, which I totally understand, a great resource that I've shared with a lot of people is just use something like Blue Letter Bible. Which you can find blueletterbible.com. It's super simple to use, and if you click on a certain passage, it's going to have for you, it's going to give you language tools for looking at certain words. It's going to align up commentaries for you that have to do with this. It'll give you relevant information. It's amazing. So I know that can seem daunting for people, but if you're really looking to take your study of the prophets deeper and want to get below the surface on some of the historical stuff so you can understand it better, a tool like that is a great place to start. And for the vast majority of people, unless you're doing academic work, that's really going to be, I think, mostly what you need. But we have to get hungry for history to get the prophets. There's kind of 3 things I think that people can do that will help in this regard. The first is we have to understand the biblical history of Israel's kings. So the more familiar you can get with 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, the better off you're going to be to understand what's going on during this era. So that's step 1. The second thing is to understand the particular era of the major and minor prophets. In our Bible class the other day, I called this time in history because really the prophets really only operated for a very short amount of time. Isaiah starts prophesying, I believe, in like 740 BC, somewhere in there, if memory serves me correctly. And the last words of the prophetic books in the Old Testament were written in about 460 BC. So that's really only about 300 years of history that's being covered. And what's happening during this time is exactly what you mentioned earlier. It's this window in which God's people have compromised and God's sending consequences. So as much as we can learn about this window in history, we're going to be better off for it. And then another thing that we can do besides learning the history of the kings, understanding the era of the prophets, is noting the main characters. So as you're going through this, if there's something that you don't understand or there's someone or something mentioned that you don't recognize, it's a good sign to stop and do a little bit of digging. But there's some recurring characters that we see over and over to pay attention to that you may or may not be familiar with. So you're going to read a lot about Judah. When the prophets talk about Judah, they're talking about the southern kingdom, which was made up of two tribes. It was the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. They were, for a while at least, the faithful kingdom. Not for long, but they held out a little bit longer than the northern kingdom. This is where Jerusalem was in Judah. Then you hear the prophets mention Israel. Now, the confusing thing sometimes is they'll sometimes talk about Israel, which was the northern 10 tribes, but they will refer to them with different names. So when you read the prophets talking about Ephraim, they mean Israel. Or when you read about Samaria, they're talking about Israel because Samaria was the capital of those 10 northern tribes. Another main character that shows up all the time is Jerusalem. Again, what can be confusing is Jerusalem is referred to by several names throughout the prophets. Within Isaiah, Jerusalem is also referred to as Zion, and sometimes, which we would have read this past week, it's referred to as Aria, which is another name for Jerusalem as well. So you'll see that. Babylon is a recurring character. That's the empire that destroyed Egypt and later the kingdom of Judah. They're the ones who burned the temple and carried all of the people out into exile. You'll read about Assyria, which is the violent northern empire that destroyed and exiled Israel in 722 BC. And then you're often going to see the same other nations being mentioned. So you're going to read about all of the nations surrounding Israel and Judah, Moab, the Philistines, Tyre, Edom, even Arabia and some of the other nations of the day. So those are some things to pay attention to, at least from a historical standpoint.
Yeah, there's a timeline that I found that maps out quite a bit. All of the kings, all of the prophets, key events, and enemy nations. And I'd put this on the screen right now if I could, but it's you can't put it on the screen. There's so much information.
Wait, we don't have the technology for that at this point. We'll get
we'd
there
have
someday.
to put a slideshow on for the next 5 minutes.
Yeah.
But maybe we can drop a link to this in the description in the show notes.
Yeah, we'll put it in the show notes for today. Yeah, that's great. That'd be a helpful thing. Another thing to mention is a great way to do this too. If you have a chronological Bible, it will make this a lot easier because it'll actually take you through as you're going through the books of Kings and Chronicles. It'll be interspersed with prophecies from that day. So that can be a helpful tool as well. Okay, so that's, I think, a very quick overview on the function and the form of the prophets. How are we doing so far, Joel?
We're doing pretty good. You're making here's what you're doing well. I think you're helping the book of Isaiah to feel more digestible.
Good. That's the goal.
Yeah, let's keep rolling.
We don't want anyone to get heartburn in the prophets, so we want it to be digestible. Okay, so then we get to the question of what do we do with it? What do we do with the prophets in order to understand what they have for us? I think the first thing that's really simple is what we want to get at in our understanding. If we can kind of wade our way into who's being talked about, what are they saying to them, then we can do this. Within every oracle, there's a critique that we can learn from.
Yes. I was waiting for us to get to this moment because you were talking about earlier how these prophecies are about Israel, not the future. However, there are critiques that we can learn from, even though it's not directly talking about, oh, this kingdom's probably really referring to the United States of America. That's right. That's not quite what's happening.
Yes. And that's not going to be the pathway to us getting faithful understanding from these. I think the simplest way to read the prophets is to get to the heart of what was God criticizing and what can we learn from that. Okay, so if we read, for example, that God is criticizing, so I love this one. This is one of my favorites. In the book of Amos, for example, Amos is absolutely dropping the heavy artillery on all the wealthy and powerful people in Samaria. Okay, he is just like all the Hollywood elites, all the wealthy billionaires with, whatever, all the powerful people in society, he's just nuking them from orbit. And in one specific passage, he calls out the real housewives of Samaria, essentially. And he says, you guys live up on the hill, you fat cows of Bashan, and you lay out beside the pool, basically all while, the poor in your society are being obliterated and crushed. You're making your wealth off the backs of the poor, all this stuff. And we'd say, oh, wow, that's brutal. But if we ask the question, well, what is he critiquing? Well, he's critiquing people who just aren't sensitive to the suffering of their neighbor, and they're eager to make a buck at the expense of someone else. Well, does that happen in the setting of our own culture in our world today? Yeah.
Yep.
All the time. So while the critique may not be of people in our day, we can certainly learn from what we're seeing about God's heart, about his desire, about his definition of righteousness. And we could say, wow, it seems like God really takes it seriously that we wouldn't live lives of comfort and ease and be ignorant of the suffering and pain of people around us. Wow, that seems like an abundantly Christian principle for living.
Yeah, to be willing to love everyone.
Absolutely. Or when the prophets go after meaningless sacrifices because the people are just going through the motions, or like in Malachi, when Malachi goes after the priests because they're offering sickly animals, and he's like, do you think God wants these sacrifices? You think he doesn't know what you're up to, that you're giving the worst, you're giving the sickly animals, you're giving, something that really doesn't cost you anything? You think God is pleased by that worship? Well, we may not be people who offer any animals in sacrifice, because we don't offer animal sacrifices. There's no earthly temple today. God's never going to build another one and reinstitute sacrifices, because that wouldn't make sense. We have Jesus now. So we might say, well, how does that apply to us? Well, it tells us something about our worship, that when we come to God with just lip service, while not actually honoring him in our hearts, God cares, God recognizes, God sees that. And in the church today, are we sometimes tempted to just make worship a formality and just give God the bare minimum? Yeah, I think that's something we all struggle with.
Yeah, that sounds like something that might come up this weekend as we go into Psalm 51 with verses 16 and 17. For you will not delight in sacrifice, or I would give it. You will not be pleased with the burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise.
Man, you nailed it. It's exactly right. And so then we can actually say, wow, that critique, even though it doesn't apply to, me exactly, because I don't have to offer sacrifices, boy, the heart of that critique certainly still finds a target in our setting and in our day and age.
Yeah.
So those are the things that we can be asking. What can we learn from this critique? Underneath each one, there's a heart behind it, and it tells us something about what God loves and what God hates, and we should take that to heart. As we're doing that, we have to remember another good principle is the primary purpose of the prophets was to reveal events that were in the immediate future to Israel and Judah. Gordon Fee makes the great observation in his book that the prophets were generally thinking in terms of decades. The way I'd say it is the prophets were thinking about decades, not millennia. They weren't thinking about, picturing or talking about what was going to happen to people 3,000 years in the future.
Yep.
They were prophesying things that were going to happen in a year, 5 years, 10 years. That was their focus. And then the other thing that can really help us as we understand, I think this is so huge, we'll come back to this a lot, especially at the end of the year in December when we get into Revelation, which I can't wait for. We can benefit from getting familiar with apocalyptic poetry.
Yep. Sorry, I jumped the gun on my reaction there because I saw it was next in the notes.
Yeah, no, that's good. I'm glad you're excited to talk about it. The prophets often use a very unique type of literature, which was Jewish apocalyptic poetry. And this was not something that they just came up with. This was something that emerged out of this exile period. There were lots of Jewish writers that wrote in this style. And so the Hebrew prophets that we read used apocalyptic language, and a lot of what they write is poetry. Now that's important because when we read poetry, we know you don't read poetry like you read a textbook, because it won't make sense.
Right.
poetry uses specific devices like exaggeration and hyperbole and metaphor in order to make a point. And we're used to that when we read other forms of poetry, but we often forget it when we come to the Bible. So the prophets are using extreme language on purpose as a poetic device to make their point. And specifically, something that happens in Jewish apocalyptic was that it uses poetic, even extreme or cosmic language to describe real world events.
Yep.
Does that make sense?
Yes, that's making sense.
So it won't just say that like, hey, there's going to be a war and it's going to be really bad. Okay, that's like what we'd expect to read. It's just,
if it was a textbook, that's probably what it would say.
Yeah, hey, there's going to be a really bad war. There's going to be this really nasty nation. And things are going to be really rough for a time. Instead, they'll say the sky is going to fall, the stars are going to come from the heavens, the earth is going to be in tumult, the oceans will be raging. And what they're doing is they're using this poetic cosmic language to describe the extreme nature of these events. And they do this all the time. So if we read this and we read, oh man, the heavens are going to be rolled up, the stars are going to fall from the sky, all this stuff, and we're like, okay, well, when does that happen? When do we ever see that happening? Well, you're not going to see that happening in a literal way because they're using poetic language to describe real world stuff. It's rich in metaphor and in illustration.
Yeah, so if I'm understanding this all right, if we were to have received none of the prophets, if the prophets were not part of our Bible, but we got Revelation as this isolated genre of literature, we would have even more of a difficult time interpreting it. We already have a hard enough time interpreting Revelation.
Yes.
But having consistency between the prophets in the Old Testament and Revelation at the very end of the New Testament, finding those common bridges and seeing historical evidence of how did the prophets talk about these apocalyptic events that were going to happen in their near future. How did those events actually play out? And we have historical documentation of what happened.
Yeah, and another good example to think of is Ezekiel in the Valley of Dry Bones. Okay, Ezekiel has this vision of a valley that's filled with dry bones and sees a vision of them coming to life again and taking on flesh and being renewed. And so if you read that and you think, okay, when did that happen? When was there a bunch of skeletons that God made rise like zombies and put flesh back on their bones? You won't see it in Israel's history. But if you understand that what he's describing is that after the exile, God's again going to breathe life into his people. And maybe even foreshadowing the sending of the Spirit to bring new life, then all of a sudden it makes sense, okay?
Yes.
That this is all extreme metaphor to illustrate things that God's going to do in history. And maybe another way to understand it too, why the language is so powerful and so explosive, is that apocalyptic literature in the Bible reveals the spiritual significance of real world events. So as you see the prophets, they're talking about, hey, this kingdom's going to fall and be overthrown, and this one's going to be destroyed, and this ruler's going to be knocked from his place. They describe that not just as like, oh, a movement of geopolitical events. They describe that as an uproar and a tumult in the heavenly places, that the powers of the cosmos are being overthrown. And in a very real way, that is what was happening, because in the world before Christ, we're told that the idols of the nations are demons. Okay, so we have pagan empires who worship demons, and there's demonic warfare and powers and all of this raging of violence in the real world where these spiritual powers are manifesting and what's happening. And then what we have is, as Christ comes on the scene, he judges all of these powers and subdues them and brings his own kingship and establishes his kingship on earth. And so what you're reading is the reason that this language is so extreme is because this is a window into the spiritual significance of what happens in our world. So the prophets give us a worldview told you that nothing that happens in our world is purely historical, is purely physical, that behind all of it, God is acting in the spiritual realm. And so when he was knocking down the king of Babylon, when he was toppling the kingdom of Assyria, he was also judging and casting down the demonic rulers of these nations in the spiritual realms and places. And so that's why we read this sort of, cosmic and spiritual language describing what's going to happen in their day.
Yeah, and the takeaway from all of this is we get a vibrant picture that our God is sovereign and in control, and he is going to make it very clear, especially in the last day, that he is God alone. No one else can ever come close to that throne.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's why the New Testament authors could say as well that when Christ ascended back into heaven, he put all of the powers under his feet. You think at this point in history, it's like as crazy and as wild as it's ever going to be. There's no time in history like this one in which the prophets were, ministering and speaking, where you have empire against empire. There's just widespread violence. The demonic powers in the spiritual realms are raging, and it's setting the stage for when Christ comes and he says, hey, now is the kingdom. The kingdom has arrived in power, because when Christ dies and he defeats the powers of darkness on the cross and rises triumphantly, he subdues the demonic rulers of the world. He puts Satan under his feet. And so the prophets are setting the stage for that. And of course, that sort of language, that sort of apocalyptic understanding of the spiritual significance of real world events is going to set the table for us, like you mentioned, in how we come back and read Revelation as we get there later in the year.
Yep. The thing that we've kept in mind this entire year is there is one God, and he is unchanging. The way we spoke about his character in the Old Testament is the same way we speak about him now in the New Testament and in the New Covenant age.
That's exactly right. And a great example of this that I just want to draw people's attention to maybe as we close today, kind of as a proof text for how we read and understand apocalyptic literature. And I picked this one just because it's so familiar to people and it directly applies to the message of Jesus. But in Isaiah chapter 19, we read Isaiah make a pronouncement about Egypt. And here's what he predicts for Egypt. He looks and he sees, look, the Lord rides on a swift cloud and is coming to Egypt. Egypt's idols will tremble before him, and Egypt will lose heart. He says, the day is coming. God is on his way. God's going to visit the Egyptians. He is riding on a cloud to visit them. And this isn't a good visit. Okay, God is coming in judgment. He's going to visit them in judgment. Now, we'd read that, and that's the metaphor, okay? That's the apocalyptic language. That's the cosmic language. Imagine the picture of God riding the clouds to come to Egypt to visit them in judgment. And then he does us a favor, because in the very next chapter, actually in the chapter where God tells him to go around in his underwear as a sign to the people of Egypt and Cush, he tells us exactly what's going to happen. He interprets that message for us. And he says in verse 4, when God tells him to go around in his underwear, stripped and barefoot, he says, so in this way, the king of Assyria will lead the captives of Egypt and the exiles of Cush, young and old alike, stripped and barefoot with bared buttocks, to Egypt's shame. So the spiritual cosmic apocalyptic language is God is riding with the clouds to come in judgment. The real world fulfillment of that is that they're going to be conquered and oppressed by Assyria. Right? So you can see how he's taking a real world event, which is Egypt is going to be conquered by a foreign nation, and he's assigning it this apocalyptic spiritual meaning. So now we go to Matthew 24. In Matthew chapter 24, we read Jesus' Olivet Discourse. This is where he is prophesying the destruction of Jerusalem. He predicts right at the beginning of the chapter, see the temple, I tell you, not one stone is going to be left upon another. He goes on to describe what's going to happen in the days surrounding the destruction of the temple. And he says, when you see all these things happen, head for the hills. In Luke, when Luke gives his account of this message, Jesus says specifically, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, that's the sign, head for the hills, get out of there because the time of its destruction has drawn near. Okay, so you have destruction of Jerusalem by another conquering nation. But in Matthew 24, what does he tell them that they're going to see? He says, you are going to see me coming with the clouds in power and glory. So if we're thinking of Isaiah, it's good to know Jesus didn't come up with that phrase. He wasn't the first one to use it. Isaiah was. And when Isaiah said that the Egyptians would see God coming with the clouds, it meant judgment. It meant destruction. And so Jesus uses the same phrase, the same imagery to describe what's going to happen to Jerusalem. Now, people will often go to Matthew 24 and they think that that's talking about the second coming. But the context is, if we're understanding how Isaiah speaks, and Jesus is almost certainly referencing Isaiah, we have to understand, okay, what he's talking about is he's not talking about his coming at the end on Judgment Day. He's talking about how he's going to visit Jerusalem in destruction and judgment.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, because that did happen, and
it did.
The temple was destroyed.
Well, and where that's important is when Jesus says that this is going, all these things are going to be fulfilled within this generation. Okay, if we're looking for that and we're like, well, when did that actually happen? We might think, well, was Jesus wrong? Was he misinformed? But no, what happened was exactly what Jesus predicted, and it's exactly what Isaiah was describing hundreds of years before when he was giving his message. And so how we read these things and how we read apocalyptic literature is really important to the integrity of our interpretation.
Yeah. How to read the Bible for all it's worth. How to understand it the best that we can.
So anyway, you know what? We are going long on time, and we're not going to get into a detailed breakdown of chapters 11 through 34. What I'll do is we did do some chapter breakdowns in our notes. Maybe I'll include that as well in the show notes for today, so you can feel free to reference them. But I hope what we accomplished today is to give you some tools so that you can feel like this is a more digestible task as you make your way through the prophets in your study of Isaiah and moving forward. So if you have questions about anything that we talked about on today's show, and there very well may be, because we covered a lot of ground really fast, you can write to us, BibleLab@lifebridgegb.org. We'd love to hear from you. And if you are getting a lot out of these episodes and they're helping you in your study, please head over to iTunes or Spotify and leave us a review. It helps our content to be more visible and helps other people find this resource for themselves. So until next time, enjoy your study of the prophets, and we'll catch you next week on the Bible Lab.